Hey, it's Mr. Spencer. We're talking about Chapter 3, a close reading of page 48, how small word choices can have great significance. Now, in Chapter 3, Nick receives a very formal invitation delivered to him by his neighbor's uniformed chauffeur in robin's egg blue uniform. Very formal, very fancy. Now, Nick's neighbor is Gatsby, of course, whose house is Party Central. Nick already partied in Chapter 2 with that apartment party with Myrtle and her sister Catherine. Tom's mistress was okay. Nick notices most people just show up to these parties, though, at Gatsby's house without being invited. It's actually kind of crazy and absurd how many people will show up. Remember, this is during Prohibition. Where do they get all the alcohol from? Is this the only place in town that they can get booze? Nick shows up nervous, and he's wearing a formal white suit. He gets a bit drunk, not knowing anyone, and he looks desperately for the elusive host of the party, Gatsby. Gatsby's nowhere to be found, but luckily Nick runs into Jordan Baker. Remember, it's Daisy's golfer friend. She escorts him around. They meet lots of random people. The story's hard to follow as Nick gets tipsier and more drunk. And they stumble into Gatsby's library and they joke around with a raging alcoholic who's wearing owl-eyed glasses. And he claims that Gatsby's books are all fake and that Gatsby doesn't exist. All right. He actually shows that some of the books in Gatsby's library, the pages aren't cut. Okay. They'd print them off at a factory and the edges were in 4 different quadrants. And then the machines in these factories were supposed to cut them. The pages weren't cut, meaning the books were not even ever meant to be opened, or Gatsby's never opened up his books. That's what this owl-eyed man with these owl-eyed glasses says. Do you remember the billboard in the Valley of Ashes, Dr. T.J. Eichelberg? Remember the eyes on the front of the book cover here? So we're trying to wonder, is this Gatsby as fake as Owl Eyes claims he is? Is Gatsby even real? What do we say about this? We've been reading, and now the rumors about Gatsby. I heard he went to Oxford University. I heard he killed a man. I heard he was relative to the Chancellor of Germany. Who is this Gatsby, and where did he get all his money from? So where is he? You'd assume reading a book called The Great Freaking Gatsby that he would show up in the first 50 pages, right? Nick wanders around at the party with Jordan anyhow, and on page 47 he finds himself with Jordan seated at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl. Nick has had finger bowls of champagne thus far. Remember, this is during Prohibition, so not everyone has easy access to booze. Is Nick getting a little carried away with this access to alcohol? The man on page 47, he looks at Nick and he says, "Your face is familiar. Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?" Nick says that this party's unusual for him as he hasn't even seen the host yet. And then the man says, rather quite anticlimactically, "I'm Gatsby." Why would Fitzgerald delay this meeting for so long? Especially after we read Chapter 2 and how random it was. Why did we take 48 pages to introduce this guy? Okay, so, yeah, here he is, the Great Gatsby. This is awkward. Nick has to stop for a moment, though. Gatsby attempts to smooth over the awkwardness, and he gives Nick a reassuring smile. All right, look at my close reading here. This is probably the most famous smile in all of literature. Notice the depth, the layers that Fitzgerald uses to describe this smile. Also, notice the spiritual, elevated tone Fitzgerald is able to color the passage with. Remember the spiritual, elevated tone that was in the Valley of Ashes passage from my last video, Chapter 2? There's also an important element in this passage of how things appear on the surface and how they really are. How things appear, but how they really are in reality. Fitzgerald develops this motif of appearances versus reality throughout this chapter and the rest of the book. Now, just because Gatsby seems so rich and great, is he really? Is he really great? Appearances versus reality. So, is this how people see America? Nick says that this magical smile vanished and he was looking at an elegant young roughneck on page 48. It's a curious word choice. So is Gatsby some sort of rough redneck? deep down? What's this roughneck? He's got a rough neck? Also, note how dashes like this are used several times, too. Dashes allow Fitzgerald, in my opinion, to dramatically interrupt himself. These dashing and dramatic interruptions also mimic the way voices and people cut in on conversations at a party, like Bernice bobs her hair, cutting into dancing. And a new voice pops in or pops out wherever you turn when you're at a crowded party. Is it hard to follow every little detail? Why is it hard for Nick to accurately convey everything that's happening to him in the summer of 1922? Consider. Think about this. How does the form and the structure of these chapters also mirror the actual experience of losing control at a crowded party? Does reading these chapters mimic the feeling of being at a loud party? How does form mirror the subject matter? How does form mirror the subject matter in these chapters? This is pretty complex style that Fitzgerald's attempting here. So, is this appearances versus reality? Is this how the rest of the world sees America? After more party shenanigans, Nick loses track of Jordan. He's made a date to see Gatsby tomorrow and try out Gatsby's new hydroplane, whatever that is. Sounds fun? We'll maybe see that in chapter 4. After stumbling around for a while, though, in chapter 3 here, Jordan finally reappears from the library, exiting with Gatsby. Why were Jordan and Gatsby alone in the library? She asked Nick how long she was in there. Nick's like, about an hour. What were they doing? Jordan says, I just heard the most amazing thing, but I swore I wouldn't tell it. Nick is curious, aren't you? Too? It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. They walk outside, leaving the party. As they leave, an apparent automobile accident has just occurred right in front of Gatsby's house. A car has crashed into a ditch. Remember, automobiles have only been around about 10 years. Consider, what's the significance of this random car crash? What could it symbolize? So, what could this car crash symbolize? We met Owl Eyes earlier on page 45. He seems random, but now here he is again, getting in a car crash at the end of the party. The author must be carefully hinting at some sort of symbolism, maybe some sort of characterization, some sort of theme, foreshadowing. Remember the idea of the Roaring Twenties? Why this car crash? Perhaps Fitzgerald uses the automobiles as a symbol. If automobiles symbolize new wealth and economic prosperity as technology continues to innovate, then what? Will the United States economy and prosperity run out of gas eventually? Could the wheels come off? Could the Roaring Twenties veer out of control, crashing violently into a ditch? Remember what's to come in the USA. It's the Roaring Twenties, but in the 1930s, what goes up must come down. Could this be Fitzgerald presciently predicting the Great Depression? I ask you to think about this. Are the wheels coming off here? At the end of chapter 3, Nick says, with either sincerity or irony, I'm one of the few honest people I've ever known. What? In my next video, we'll talk about chapter 4. Are we going to get on a hydroplane with Gatsby? Keep reading to find out. This is Mr. Spencer, signing off.